So Rand Paul and Ted Cruz are obviously going to run against one another in the Republican primaries in 2016. So they have to pretend to like each other while secretly despising one another. And how are they going to beat each other up? Well, of course, with the ghost of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan would make love to me harder than he would make love to Rand. Oh man, Ronald Reagan, if he was here, he'd be whispering sweet nothings into my ear. In fact, he is, and that's why I keep talking about him and telling you what he would do. So now there's an old game in the Republican Party. We've seen this in primary after primary. So this storied tradition continues now. First, Rand Paul.
Interesting thing is that I opposed with real fervor the involvement of us in Syria, and that became the dominant position in the country, both Republican and Democrat. There's not one Republican who's saying we should put military troops into Crimea or into Ukraine. So I think I'm right in the middle of that position. And I think those who would try to argue that somehow I'm different than the mainstream Republican opinion are people who want to take advantage for their own personal political gain. I'm a great believer in Ronald Reagan. I'm a great believer in a strong national defense. In fact, what Ronald Reagan said in about one sentence sums up really a lot of what I believe. He said to our potential adversaries, he said, don't mistake our reluctance for war for a lack of resolve. People knew that with Ronald Reagan. They still need to know that with the United States. And part of the problem is I think this president hasn't projected enough strength and hasn't shown a priority to the national defense.
It's like not only do you have to mention Ronald Reagan, you have to repeat his name as many times as possible in the midst of the answer. We've seen this in the last primary and the one before that. Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan, oh yeah. Okay, so apparently Ronald Reagan would have been on Rand Paul's side. Except Ted Cruz is not on that side in foreign policy. He'd like to be more muscular. God, there's so many awesome sexual references here. Anyway, so he's going to quote Ronald Reagan on his side. Let's see.
I'm a big fan of Rand Paul. He and I are good friends. I don't agree with him on foreign policy. I think U.S. leadership is critical in the world. And I agree with him that we should be very reluctant to deploy military force abroad. But I think there is a vital role, just as Ronald Reagan did. When Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, when he stood in front of the Brandenburg Gate and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, those words changed the course of history. The United States has a responsibility to defend our values.
Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan. Okay, all right. So who's right, who's wrong? First of all, who cares? I don't know if you know, but Ronald Reagan's been dead a while, right? And he certainly hasn't been president in decades, but they can't let him go. Why? Because he's the only Republican president that has any semblance of popularity in anyone's lifetime that's still alive today. Nixon, impeach, ran out of the office, I gotta get out of here, I gotta get out of here. Resigned in disgrace, right? And then George W. Bush, a laughingstock, not just all over the world, but in this country. George H.W. Bush, they don't like him in his own party. So Reagan, Reagan. So let's talk about the real Ronald Reagan. He ran from Beirut. You remember what happened there? There's bombings in 1983. 299 American and French servicemen killed by the Islamic Jihad. 241 American servicemen killed, 220 Marines. That was the largest death toll for Marines since Iwo Jima in World War II. And what did Reagan do? Did he crush the Islamic Jihad? Did he stay in Lebanon and win that war? No, he ran. He ran for the hills. Now, you might agree with that policy. Hey, it was foolish of him to bring those troops in there in the first place. And you might say, hey, it's better that he avoided a longer and more protracted war. That's a fair point. But saying that he's some sort of awesome being who crushes all of his enemies. He ran, it's not in dispute. He ran, he's like, oh, Islamic Jihad, ah! He ran for the hills. That's who Ronald Reagan is. Furthermore, you know what he did? He traded arms for hostages. You know what that means? He dealt with Iran, he dealt with terrorists, and he gave them weapons. Not only could Ronald Reagan not win in a Republican primary today, he'd be laughed out of it. He couldn't possibly win in a Democratic primary because they'd say, this guy, he negotiates with terrorists. That's what he did in his time as president. Are you kidding me with the love for Ronald Reagan? These days, they'd call him a bitch. They'd say, this weak ass. Look, if I haven't been harsh enough yet, let me take it over the top for you. They would call Ronald Reagan a pussy. They say he ran from Beirut and he negotiated with the Iranians and gave arms to terrorists. That's what Ronald Reagan did. But to be fair, he did kick Grenada's ass. Ooh, and he said a couple of tough words to Gorbachev. Wow, did you? Oh, tear down this wall. Watch me run from Islamic Jihad, but please tear down this wall. That's your beloved Ronald Reagan? That's your only hero? That's the only guy you could ever talk about? How sad. How pathetic. You want him? Rand Paul or Ted Cruz? Have him.